John Edmund Bailey, known as Jack to his family, was born on the 13th of February of 1891 in Thornton Heath. His parents had met there. His dad was a police constable in Thornton Heath police station, and his mum lived around the corner. Jack was born quite early in their marriage, and a year after he arrived, a baby brother was born, Stanley. When the boys were both young, the family came to Banstead when his father transferred to Banstead Police Station, which was in the Metropolitan Police in those days. And the police station in the 1890s used to stand on the opposite side of the road to where it is now. It was part of Buff House, some old outbuildings that had been converted. And they actually lived in the police station. It wasn't until 1906, 1907 that the current police station, well, it's not the current police station anymore, is it? The new old police station, whichever way around it is, was built and the police moved across. And when they moved, Jack's father decided it was time to retire from the force. And so the family stayed on in Banstead area, but they moved up to Ferndale Road, to number 10. It's one of the first houses to be built in Ferndale Road. Diceland and Shrubland Road had been built first. After that came Ferndale and Lyme Regis Road. So it was a modern house for the time. They were fairly well-to-do in terms of, they had a pension coming in from the police. The boys were just getting old enough to earn their own money as well. And it was a fairly roomy house for a small family. Jack went to school locally. Unfortunately, we've lost most of the school records, so we don't know very much about his time there. He was in the choir here at All Saints with another chap we've commemorated, Fred Davis. And as well as singing at weddings and funerals, they would go out every winter singing carols around the neighbourhood, collecting money for their summer treat. And in the summer, they would go off to the seaside for a big annual trip together. Now, although he was in the choir, Jack hadn't actually been baptised when he was a baby. And so he was baptised at the quite late age of 16. He was confirmed the following day. We used to send confirmation classes off to be confirmed at places like Dorking and Ewell once a year. And he went off the very next day to be confirmed by the Bishop of Dorking. He became a grocer's assistant when he left school. And then after that, a gardener at Nork Park. And he used to live in Concertina Lodge, which is no longer there today. There are some foundations still there. He used to stand on the Reigate Road, and it looked like a concertina standing on its end, sort of this hexagonal shape building, which is how it got its name. There's just a couple of bedrooms, and he lived there with the senior gardener. He wasn't there for very long, and he started off working at the asylum. He transferred to the asylum in the spring of 1914, working as an attendant there, earning about £32 a year, pretty good money, and he also got accommodation and meals thrown in. All the single, unmarried attendants lived in two big accommodation blocks on the site of the asylum, and that's where he lived. And he was still there when war broke out. Now, London County Council encouraged all of their employees to join up. They continued to pay them their council salaries on top of what they were taking home from the army. And they also were given a promise that their jobs would be kept open. They would only hire temporary men to fill in, only men that were not of military age or were unfit for service. And so, encouraged by this, Jack and almost all of the men of military age at the asylum signed up for service fairly early on in the war. He joined the army in April of 1915. He had a medical up at Shoreditch and was then sent to join his battalion, the 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers at Wrexham. He trained in the depot there and was sent out to France in the autumn of 1915. The 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers had fought on the first day of the Battle of Lewes. They'd lost 400 men that day, something over 50% casualties probably, and they were in desperate need of reinforcements. He was one of about 200 men that were sent out to join them in October. They were holding the line in the north of France by the La Bassée Canal, villages of Coinchy and Givenchy, pretty grotty trenches, lots of water very near the surface, so they'd often flood, and it was always raining, always cold, so they were very often just flooded with water. There was an awful lot of work to be done. They were quite shallow trenches, they weren't particularly advanced, they weren't like the great defences that the Germans put their efforts into, with concrete bunkers 20 feet underground and all these banks of wire hundreds of yards thick. They were still quite makeshift affairs, really. And so they had an awful lot of work getting them into good conditions. They're only in the line for a couple of days at a time because the weather was that bad, and men would get exposure very quickly, frostbite and things like that. So they were rotated very rapidly in and out of the line. At the end of the autumn and progressing through winter, they were holding these lines, and then in December they were pulled out of the line for a prolonged period of rest, recuperation and training. And they spent 2 months in training. All sorts of things. Basically, they had to retrain all these hastily trained reinforcements that had joined the professional army, and they had to retrain all these old soldiers that had been in the trenches for the last year, because they had to retrain them for fighting open warfare. We were going to launch a big offensive in 1916, and these men were just, they were getting slow, they're losing their fighting skills, having just been in trenches for months. And so they were getting all these men up to speed. They were teaching them how to navigate, how to march across country using a map and a compass, being the advance guard, the flank guard, the rear guard for columns, what to do, how to fight an encounter battle, what happens if you meet a German force in the countryside, what do you do? All these sorts of things. Rapid entrenching, these sorts of skills that would save their lives. And as part of that training, they were upskilling their men in all kinds of different things. And one of the things they were doing was they were teaching them how to fight with grenades. The grenade was the most important weapon in trench warfare. You fought with a grenade, possibly with a club, because trenches were all sort of wiggly and you couldn't shoot down them really. You threw over the bend in the trench. And Jack was taught how to use grenades. He was probably sent to a grenade school for a course, and he had a 2-day examination, which he passed and earned the right to wear the grenade badge. He was in B Company, but he probably spent a lot of his time with the battalion's bombers on special assignments. They moved down to the Somme in February of 1916. It was very quiet down there at the time. Its countryside is very much like it is here, rolling chalk downland. It hadn't been churned into a lunar landscape yet. The French and the Germans had something of a truce down there, so there was a lot of, the landscape was quite intact still. It was only when we arrived, when we started to ramp up the hostilities, our commanders didn't believe in letting sleeping dogs lie. We had to keep our men active, always doing things, always provoking the Germans. The net result, of course, was that all the Germans did was to strengthen their defences, so that when we did finally go into attack, we had much more to contend with than we might have otherwise. So they were down there from February 1916 for about 6 months or so. It was quiet at first. Gradually, the intensity of activity started to build up. We had agreed with the French we were going to launch a joint offensive between the Ancre and the Somme rivers sometime in the spring or the summer of 1916, and we were flooding the area with men. The Germans knew something was up. So there was a lot of mining activity underground on the front that Jack's battalion were holding, and there was a lot of artillery activity starting to build up in May and June. It started to become an increasingly dangerous place to be. They were holding trenches south of the village of Mametz. They were on a low ridge, and the Germans were down in the valley. The line there formed sort of a triangle, a salient, and the German line went from east-west and turned the corner to go north-south. And this salient, the Fricourt salient, they were holding trenches by there for the entirety of their time there. So they got to know their stretch of line particularly well. At places, the no man's land was very narrow. It was only 50 yards wide. At other places, it was 100 yards wide. And those narrow bits were the danger points. That's where the Germans and the British would be detonating mines underneath to create these craters that they might rush into no man's land to garrison and extend their trenches just a little bit further. They were there, as I said, for some months. And as these hostilities started to ramp up, and we got nearer and nearer to this offensive, we needed information. And so we launched raids across into the German lines. And Jack took part in one of those raids on the 25th of May. There were 25 men, and they were divided into 5 sections, 4 men led by an NCO. Jack was an NCO by then, he'd been promoted to sergeant, and led by an officer. There was a big crater in front of them, and their task was to sneak through the German wire, get into a trench that ran around the near lip of this crater, split up into 2 parties, get into a trench behind the crater, destroy all they could, kill as many Germans as they could, inspect their trenches to see what their defences were like, and bring back prisoners to identify the units that they were facing, and assess the morale of the enemy and gain whatever intelligence they could. And so they went out just after midnight on this raid. There was no artillery bombardment before. They were sneaking across. They weren't going to announce their arrival. And they got through the German wire and climbed up the side of the crater and dropped down into the trench on the other side, only to find it deserted. There were some signs that the Germans were using it. There were some sniper posts, but either side of them, the trench was blocked with wires. So they had to come out and sneak around the crater. And they came across a big, impassable thicket of wire. The officer thought he'd spotted a way through, though, and so he led the men around the left-hand side of this crater. And as they did so, one of the Germans in Kiel trench beneath them, just about 5 to 7 yards away from where they were, heard them and started throwing grenades up at them. The men, of course, were all bombers, or most of them were bombers. They were all armed as well. So they started throwing grenades back, and a grenade fight ensued. German snipers joined in, and then the artillery started shelling no man's land in the British line, cutting these men off. The Germans were, according to the officer, very lucky with their grenade throwing, and they managed to kill one man and wound 11 of them. One of those men was Jack, and he was hit by a piece of shrapnel in his forearm, and he was sent home to be treated. He wasn't here for very long, though, and he returned to join his unit on the 30th of June, the eve of the Battle of the Somme, and he was with them when they attacked the next day. As I said, they were by this Fricourt salient, this triangular bit of line, and either side at the base of the triangle were the villages of Fricourt and Mametz. And our British commanders, they do get a bit of a reputation for needless waste of lives, but they weren't stupid men, and they realised that there was really no strategic value in us taking the trenches in this little triangle of line. What they were really after was the villages behind it. And so they were going to send 2 divisions attacking either side of this salient, and they would capture these villages. And only then would they deal with whatever Germans had been left in those triangles. And so 7th Division, including men like Harry Bates of Banstead Road, that died on the 1st of July, supported by the artillery commanded by one of our local men, Archie Buckle, and the guns of one of our other local men, George Daniels. They were all in action on the right-hand side, attacking Mametz, and on the left-hand side, another division was attacking just north of Fricourt. Only once they had got behind this salient would we go into this triangle. And that's what Jack's battalion were tasked with doing. They were the support battalion. Ahead of them were the 20th Manchesters. They were expecting to go in at mid-morning, but either side they were delayed. The attacks were delayed. And so they had to wait until the afternoon, hours after the battle had started. The 20th Manchesters went. There were too many Germans in front of them, too many machine guns, and they got very badly cut up. And so the Royal Welsh Fusiliers was sent off to support them. One of the units going in as part of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers was the bombers. We don't know if Jack was with them, but it's a possibility. And they were tasked with taking a particular rectangular section of trenches, which was the key to the whole position, establishing blocks. So they'd pull down the trench walls to create a great big barricade, pile it up high with whatever they could, and then throw their bombs over the top of it. And this they did, very successfully. And they took the next trench, and they drove out the German machine gun team that had caused so many casualties with the 20th Manchesters. Other troops of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers came up to support them and hold the ground that they had helped capture. And behind them, back in the British frontline trenches, were Jack's company. He might have been with them rather than with the bombers those days, and maybe didn't go into action that day. But he would have his turn very soon. The village of Fricourt nearby was abandoned by the Germans, captured by the British on the 2nd of July. We had a pause, a break of a day on the 3rd of July, and then we renewed our offensive on the 4th of July. And Jack and his battalion were sent to capture a trench called Quadrangle Trench, which was north. It was on a slope of a valley north of Bottom Wood. A railway ran through this valley and then up past this trench they were to capture. And on the far right from this trench they were captured was Mametz Wood. The men in the middle of the night marched up to this wood at the bottom of the valley, Bottom Wood. They crept through the wood to the northern edge. And then behind the cover of their artillery barrage, they advanced as close as they possibly could to this trench they were to capture. When they got there, the artillery barrage was supposed to lift at 12:45 a.m. It didn't quite lift all the way along Jack's company's sector. So they were held back behind this barrage. When they tried to get forward, they suffered heavy casualties as they did so. And soon they were in disarray. They were all in confusion, as the report called it. And they sent for reinforcements. Those reinforcements, the bombers and one of the other companies, started to make their way up. But B Company were rallied, and it was the NCOs, after the officers had been left, it was the NCOs like Jack who would have rallied those men and got them moving, and they got into the German trench. And soon the Royal Welsh Fusiliers had captured their objective. The battalion next door, the Royal Irish, had failed to reach theirs, And so they were sent along to try and bomb their way along this trench, and it was probably Jack's company that were to do that. And Jack would have been at the forefront of that, trying to get over to this other trench. They failed in the end. There was a section of open ground that had to be crossed, 60 or 70 yards. It was swept by machine gun fire, and daybreak was fast approaching, and they had to give it up as a bad thing. But Jack was awarded the military medal for his actions on the Somme, and it was probably in that fight on that day that he earned it. They came out of the line for a few days' rest, and then were back in action on the 14th of July as we again renewed the offensive, a second major phase of the offensive. The second German line snaked along the Bazentin Ridge through the villages of Bazentin-le-Petit, Bazentin-le-Grand, and it was the job of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers to attack those villages as part of a second wave, as it were, and go through to Highwood, the infamous Highwood, beyond. We had a breakthrough very early in the day. We got through that German second line. It was all going very well. And the Germans were pulling back, and they'd abandoned this wood in the distance, Highwood, one of the key objectives of the attack. And the infantry advanced up to it. Scouts reported it was completely empty. The infantry said, "Shall we take it? Shall we go?" But they were told no by their commanders, because there was already a plan set in motion long ago, that the cavalry were going to advance through this wood and then disrupt the German lines of communication beyond. It was their one opportunity they'd really had in the war so far. They'd been waiting almost 2 years for it. Unfortunately, they were positioned far too far away, even though they started moving early in the morning. At 12:30, when Jack's battalion were getting ready to take their part in the attack, they were still miles away. And they didn't arrive until the evening, unfortunately, when the Germans had already reoccupied the wood and placed their machine guns along the edge of it. With no sign of the cavalry in place, Jack's battalion was sent up to deal with a German counterattack that was coming in. They had to march in artillery formation, plenty of space between each man, several yards apart, but they were advancing over open ground as they went, and they were shelled very heavily. And it was probably at the point that they were advancing through that shell fire that Jack was wounded. He was hit in the left leg by a piece of shrapnel. We don't know how bad it would have been at the time. It might have been fairly innocuous, he might have kept on going, or it might have rendered him completely unable to walk. We do know that he didn't make it to a field ambulance the next day. Until the next day. So he either lay out all night waiting to be rescued, or took a long time to crawl back to his lines, or perhaps he was able to carry on with his men and only got sent to the medical officer when he felt it was absolutely necessary, when the fighting was over. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers carried on advancing. They dealt with this German counterattack, and they were there when the cavalry belatedly arrived, charged across the cornfield, and were cut down by the machine guns on the edge of High Wood. They were withdrawn the next day, and perhaps it was as late as that that Jack arrived at the field ambulance. He was evacuated to a casualty clearing station, and then to a hospital at Rouen, and then sent home in fairly short order back to Britain. He went to a hospital, the Hague Lawn Hospital up in Cheshire, and innocuous as it may have been, he never left hospital. Unfortunately, there was shrapnel embedded in his calf, behind the bigger of the tibia, the bigger of the shin bones. And it was very close to the protective tissue that surrounds the bones, and that was causing problems. It was causing inflammation and a lot of pain. So when he arrived at that hospital, his leg was swollen, his 3 outside toes were in a lot of pain, and there was already pus beginning to ooze out of this wound. So operations were taking place to remove the piece of shrapnel, then to clean the wound. But he was still in a lot of pain even months later, and x-rays showed that his bone was in effect rotting away under that tissue. And so another operation was carried out to scrape away the dying bone tissue. He healed for several weeks, and it seemed to be going well. But then on Christmas Day, 1917, trouble erupted again, and his leg became swollen, and he was in pain once more. They operated again. This time they cut out the whole area of where the wound was, and they removed a section of dead bone tissue from his shin. He was recovering apparently well, but then developed a temperature of 103 degrees. It soon became clear that he had developed pneumonia, acute pneumonia, in his left lung. His father rushed up to Cheshire to be with him. 6 days later, unfortunately, Jack died with his father at his bedside. He was just 26 years old. Jack was buried here in the churchyard. He's not buried with war graves, just a little bit further away in what became the family grave. Unfortunately, he wasn't alone for long, as his mother died just 3 months later, also buried in that grave. A very hard time for the Baileys, as it was for many of our local families at that time. Thank you very much for coming today, and we will be laying a wreath after the service.
It's a very comforting thought to think that over 100 years ago Jack was here in this very building, probably sitting in the pews you're sitting in today, and certainly sitting in the pastels behind me, and he'll go on to come into the continuing. So let us pray. Father of all, remember your promise and look with love on all your people, living and departed. On this day we especially remember Jack Bailey and ask that you would hold forever all who suffered during the First World War, those who returned scarred by warfare, those who waited anxiously at home, and those who returned wounded and disillusioned, those who mourned, and those communities that were diminished and suffered loss. Remember too those who acted with kindly compassion, those who bravely risked their own lives for their comrades, and those who in the aftermath of war worked tirelessly for a more peaceful world. And as you remember them, remember us. O Lord, grant us peace in our time, and a longing for the day when people of every language, race and nation will be brought into the unity of Christ's kingdom. This we ask in the name of the same Jesus Christ our Lord. As our Saviour taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Would you please stand? God, grant to the living grace, the departed rest, the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth, and all the world peace and concord, and to us and all God's servants life everlasting. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father,